So today we are going to start, by looking at somatic nervous system. So we actually started somatic nervous system last time when we talked about different receptors and we talked about the pathways, because those pathways are actually the somatic pathways. And so that's why I like to finish this up, and then we can get into the autonomic afterwards and compare and contrast them. Now, this book that we're using, it for some reason puts general and special senses all in the same chapter. And so the chapter that covers the somatic nervous system is actually the same one as special senses. But I like to cover special senses last. I think it makes more sense, or maybe it's just because I'm used to it. It doesn't matter why, but so I split them out to cover it in the order that I'm used to, because I feel like I can get a better flow that way. So that's in there, but we're going to cover those afterwards. So a little bit of this we covered, like I said, but we're going to now get into a little bit more detail about what it means when we talk about somatic. And so that means that we want to look at what happens as the sensory information from those receptors actually makes its way up to our cerebral cortex. So what happens to sensory information between stimulating the receptors and being perceived by us as sensation? So basically this is how we process information. So it's raw data coming in, processed into what we see and hear and touch and all that, okay? And so that requires several different levels of integration, which remember is the big middle function of the nervous system as a whole. Integration occurs anytime we have neurons synapsing with each other. So if we have 3 levels of integration, then it stands to reason that we have 3 levels of synapses. So we're going to talk about integration at the level of the receptors, at the level of what we call circuits, and then at the level of perception, which is actually going to be in the cerebral cortex. Why did I put, oh, right, yeah. So this is sort of like an overall summary of that, all 3 levels, except that it also includes muscle. So I think I just looked up somatic integration and found something, and I was like, oh, that works, but just put sensory receptors in here, and it works great. Okay, so receptor level processing is everything that happens to actually get signals out of your sensory receptors. So remember we talked about different receptor endings last time, right? Yes, and how they can just be like little naked dendrites, or they can be, you know, encapsulated nerve endings, like the corpuscles that we're looking at in lab. And I kind of mentioned this stuff before, but I want to go back over it and say, if we're actually going to get an action potential coming off of this sensory nerve and going into the spinal cord, we need the right stimulus for the right receptor. So receptors all have what we call specificity, which means that they're only going to respond to the type of stimulus that triggers them. So when we have a mechanoreceptor, for example, it's only going to respond to pressure, or it's only going to respond to, you know, vibration or touch. And don't ask me what the difference is to a receptor between touch and pressure, but it's different, okay? And like thermoreceptors, you know, they're pretty specific too. So it's either only going to respond to heat or it's only going to respond to cold. And it's not going to have any reaction to a different stimulus. So in order to get a signal, we have to be specific for that type of receptor. And we have to apply that stimulus within the appropriate range. So each receptor has a receptive field. And it's easiest to think about this for our exteroreceptors, the ones that are like on the surface of our skin. So, you know, we can have a receptor where the dendrites are like covering this much area. And so as long as the stimulus is applied to the skin at any range of that, then they're going to respond. But if we have one that's just this big, then in order to get a response from that receptor, it has to be applied within that field. So if you don't have the right type of stimulus and you don't have it in the right location, you can't stimulate the receptor, okay? And then the last thing that we look at as far as how we get an action potential is signal transduction. So the ultimate goal of sensory receptors is to take whatever sensory stimulus they're sensitive to and convert it into electrical energy. And it's going to start as graded potentials, and then ultimately it's going to become action potentials. So transduction, because we're changing the type of stimulus, essentially, or the type of energy. So transduction is where we bring in our graded potentials again. Because remember that we use graded potentials to end up triggering action potentials for neurons. And there's two types of graded potentials that we can have when we're looking at sensory receptors. And it's just a matter of whether or not the sensory neuron is the sensory receptor, or if there's a separate sensory cell that is then synapsed with the sensory neuron. So a generator potential is when we generate graded potentials on a sensory neuron that is also the sensory receptor. And so if those graded potentials add up to threshold, depolarize to threshold, we get an action potential. Receptor potentials, on the other hand, is when we have graded potentials, sorry, let me say it again, is when we have special sensory cells that then synapse with the sensory receptor, with the sensory neuron, okay? So now the sensory neuron itself isn't the receptor, it has its own little assistant cell to do that part. So these are also graded potentials on the sensor's part, but instead of depolarizing to threshold, we get a little bit of neurotransmitter released across a chemical synapse that then causes graded potentials on the sensory neuron that can then depolarize to threshold. So the difference is just one more step. There's one more step here. Okay? And most of the special sensory cells that then synapse with sensory neurons, they're in our special senses. So we'll see them more when we talk about our special senses. Most of the general senses have generator potentials because the sensory neuron is the sensory receptor. And then this is a little visual about receptor fields. So the receptive field, again, is the area that the sensory ending or the sensor is able to detect its stimulus, and they can be larger or smaller depending on location. And the easiest way to think about this is when we look at the sense of touch. So different parts of our skin have different sized receptive fields for our sense of touch. And basically, if you have a large receptive field, you don't need very many sensory neurons to cover an area. But that also means that that skin isn't particularly sensitive in that you don't know exactly where you're feeling something. So this big old blotch here, this is the entire, this is, I'm pretty sure, exaggerated, but this is the entire receptive field of a single touch receptor. So anywhere on there will register as the same sensation. You won't know where on your shoulder blade approximately you're feeling that. But we look at the receptor field somewhere like our forearms, and it's a little bit smaller. And when we look at the receptive fields somewhere like our hands, they're much, much smaller. So we have a lot more nerve endings in that area, and that makes them much more sensitive to specific. We know exactly where we're being touched or what we're touching, okay? So there's a trade-off. Bigger receptive fields means you don't need as many sensory neurons, but you also don't know exactly which part of that field is being touched. It all registers the same. And if we had live labs, we would do one where we call it 2-point discrimination, where we take little tools with 2 little prongs that can be spread different distances apart, and you would have your partner close their eyes and you would touch them with it, and they would have to tell you whether they felt 1 or 2 touches. Because if you use 2 touches in the same receptive field, it's going to register as 1. And so that's kind of how we get a better feel for how that works. Okay, so that's the point of receptive fields. Okay, so that's actually the majority of the processing that takes place at the receptor level, but there is one more thing that can happen, and it's called adaptation. So the idea behind adaptation is that when sensory receptors are being stimulated, it's not a black and white thing. It's not like, yes, we're feeling it, and no, we're not feeling it. And we know that if we think about the kinds of things that we can perceive through our skin. So sensory receptors are also able to send signals in a way that communicates the strength of a stimulus, the duration of a stimulus, and the pattern if it's being repeated. And it does that with variable frequencies of the action potentials that it sends. So generally, a higher frequency of action potentials coming from a sensory receptor means a stronger stimulus. And another way, especially that they can communicate the duration of a stimulus, is by no longer reporting the same stimulus strength with the same response. So a lot of receptors, when they're being stimulated by a constant stimulus, so let's say that somebody's touching the back of your hand or the back of your arm, and it's exactly the same pressure and it doesn't change. Over time, you're going to stop being aware of that because the sensory receptor isn't sending as many signals out. So basically it's like, yeah, we've heard this before. We don't need to keep reporting it. It's there. And so we call that adaptation, this idea that a receptor is not going to be as stimulated by a constant level of stimulus as if it had just happened and then stopped. So that's another way that it's able to report to the higher levels what's going on. Now, there's actually 2 types of sensory receptors when it comes to adaptation. So a lot of receptors are very fast to adapt, and whenever there's any sort of constant stimulus, they very rapidly stop sending signals. So we call them phasic receptors. Phase kind of refers to like time. And what we see is that we'll see like a burst of impulses when a stimulus begins, and then very rapidly the stimuli or the action potentials taper down, but then when the stimulus ends, you get another burst. And we see this very commonly for receptors monitoring internal and external conditions. And we know this. This is literally why our clothes don't drive us crazy, because we are not constantly aware of the sensation of everything on our skin at all times. We stop, we actually have our receptors stop, sending it out. And that's one of the reasons why when you wear something that fits you differently than you're used to, even if it's like shoes or something, like you're very aware of it for longer than you normally would be, because this is outside of your normal stimuli. Now, it's not safe for all of our receptors to do this. So we do have receptors that either never adapt, so they never change how much signal they're sending out based on a sustained stimulus, or they do it very, very slowly. And so these guys are called tonic receptors. And our nociceptors, so our pain receptors, and then our proprioceptors, the ones that report our body position and movement for our muscles, joints, tendons, etc., they're tonic. And that makes sense because pain is a protective defense mechanism, right? It's warning us that things are bad and are going to hurt us. So we don't want to tune that out. We want to be aware of that. Obviously, in practical application, that can have a downside because sometimes we can't always do anything about that pain. And then proprioceptors make sense too, right? Our brain, we've talked about what the cerebellum does and other motor-related areas, needs a constant input to know exactly where our body is in space, right? To maintain posture or to move appropriately. So we can't ever stop sending those signals. Okay, so that's adaptation. Now, we don't really have time to go into all the levels of processing at higher levels. And also, I know that when I go over that, some people are bound to think, okay, but like my pain can fade over time even when the pain stimulus is constant. So how does that work? Well, it works at higher levels. So your brain is also capable of adaptation. It's just doing it at a different level. So instead of the receptors changing their stimulus, your brain changes how much you notice the stimulus. And we see that all the time with smell. We'll talk about it again a little bit when we get to the special sense of smell, but our ability to adjust to like background odors especially is because of something that's happening in your brain. It's not because the receptors are changing their impulses. It's because your brain is like, yeah, we can ignore that. It's the same, right? And then you like walk away and you come back to it and you're like, oh God, how did I not notice that? Well, it's been there the whole time. And since I live in Ontario, I can assure you that's exactly how it works because every day I walk outside and I'm like, oh, right, I live near a dairy. And this weird picture that you're seeing is up there because this applies to a lot of senses. These weird goggles actually make it look like the world is upside down. And as we'll talk about more when we get to vision, when images hit your eyes, they are actually upside down. And your brain has to flip everything. And I know that doesn't make any sense. It'll make more sense when we talk about sight, but your brain has the ability to completely flip the world. And so if you change what you're seeing so that everything looks upside down to you, eventually you'll adapt to it. Your brain has the ability to just adjust to that based on all the other input. It's like, oh, well, I know how gravity works and I know what my hands are doing and how they're moving because of my proprioceptors. I'll just figure this out until it's normal. It's the weirdest thing. But that's perceptual adaptation, okay? That doesn't happen at the level of the receptors. It happens at the level of our brain. Okay, so circuit level processing refers to anything that's happening at the synapses between receptors. So remember we talked about the general pathways to the brain. It's a 3-neuron, 2-synapse pathway, right? So we start with the sensory neuron, and those are the guys with the cell bodies in the dorsal root ganglia. They're going to synapse at the level of the spinal cord, and then they're going to send signals up to the thalamus, which synapses, and then we send stuff up to the cortex. So anything that happens at those synapses is going to be circuit level processing. So if any processing occurs at the level of the spinal cord or the thalamus, it's going to fall under this category. One of the things that's always going to happen is crossing over from right to left, right? Decussation. And I bring it up again because it's important to remember that the only way for the left side of your brain to control the right side of your body and vice versa is that all of the pathways have to cross over. And it's going to happen before the level of the thalamus because the thalamus is always going to send things to the same side of the cortex on the same side as it's receiving information. So crossover has to happen either in the brainstem or in the spinal cord. Another thing that, again, we've talked about this before, but it's circuit level processing. So the somatotopy, where, oh, I guess this one's not actually somatotopy. So the, the fact that different parts of your cortex process different sensations is part of the organization process of those pathways. So like this is showing that like there's different pathways for touch and proprioception, and this is showing how, you know, pain and temperature are taking different pathways. So they're hitting your brain all very organized by sensation, right? By what's the stimulus that triggered the receptors. Everything is very, very organized in your nervous system, okay? So the type of receptor, all those guys end up running together. And then that's the somatotopy. And then not only are they running together, but they're hitting the brain in what's roughly a map of the body, right? So again, highly organized as it hits the cortex. So that means that when your cerebral cortex gets information, simply by where the information is hitting your brain, your cerebral cortex knows what that information is referring to, touch, pressure, temperature, pain, whatever, and exactly where it's coming from in the body. And for the most part, that's a really good thing. That's just part of how the brain is organized and keeps a good map of all the body's sensory input. But that also has implications for other things, as I'll mention when we get to referred pain in the autonomic nervous system. So that's a little teaser there. Okay, so that's circuit level processing. It's all the stuff that happens to the route of the information between the sensory receptor and the cortex. And I know that those things don't seem like processing because they're not processing in the sense of like changing the information. It's more just redirecting the path, okay? And then that takes us to a couple things, though, that can happen on the way to the cerebral cortex, which is basically reflexes. I almost emphasized that totally wrong, and that would have been really weird. So a lot of reflexes that occur, and we'll talk about more of them later, reflexes occur before the cerebral cortex is aware of the incoming information. And that's because reflexes have to be faster than the cerebral cortex can process information. So one thing that happens, for example, to our ability or our hearing is as sounds are processed between the receptors that do it, which we'll talk about tomorrow, and you know, the cerebral cortex, the part of the temporal lobe that processes your hearing, it stops synapses in your brainstem and gives you something called sound localization. So sound localization is how your brain automatically, give me 1 second, I can't even. Okay, sound localization is our ability to turn our head in the direction that a sound is coming from. And it's a reflexive action, as in it happens without us having to think about it, no cerebral cortex involvement. So it happens at the level of the brainstem, and we have a nucleus that does it in the midbrain, I'm pretty sure. And so basically sound information is going to be processed at that level, and your brain is able to calculate the difference in when a sound hits each ear and the difference in the volume of it hitting each ear, and that tells it exactly where it's coming from, which is kind of crazy. Okay, so that's just an example of circuit level processing that reflexes are included in this. This is an example of the kind of processing that we can do with our eyes too. So this is called the vestibulo-ocular reflex, the ability for us to keep our eyes locked on something even when our head and or body are moving. And of course, it was way more fun to find a chicken video than a person video, because the people ones were a little creepy, to be honest. So this is also going to occur at the level of your brainstem. It's going to get information from both your vision and your vestibular sense, which literally tracks your head's location. And that's what lets you do that. And as you can see, other species are really good at it too. Birds are really, really good at it, not just chickens. And then this is a basic kind of chart of how that works. So there's vestibular sense coming from your inner ears, we'll talk about later. And there's synapsing here in the pons and sending information up to the midbrain where it connects with the nuclei that control your extraocular muscles. And so it's literally using your vestibular senses knowledge of where your head is in space to control your eye muscles to keep them locked on things, which is pretty cool. This is the super creepy one. Felt compelled to share anyway. It looks like he's kind of trying to break her neck. I don't like it. And apparently it's like the only example that exists because this GIF existed in many, many forms. Okay, so circuit level processing, all right? And see, I knew this slide was out of order. This slide goes to the pictures above. Sorry about that. I don't know how these things happen. Okay, so that takes us to perceptual level processing. So perceptual level processing is all about the interpretation of the sensory input. So this is processing in, I would think, the most classical way we think about processing of like really like analyzing the information. And this also occurs below our level of awareness. So even though we're processing in the cerebral cortex, this occurs before we know, you know, we're consciously aware of these sensations. So all of this is called perception. It's all the perception is our awareness of it. And so the filtering that occurs between our cerebral cortex getting the sensory input, which is basically still raw data at that point, and then actually like refining it to what we're aware of, results in our perception of reality. And like I mentioned before, the sense localization and the somatotopy mean that our brain knows which sensations and where they're coming from our whole bodies. So sensory perception means that what we see is not reality. Instead, what we see is a shortcut because our brain is receiving so much information on a moment-to-moment basis that we don't have the capacity to fully process all of it. Like if we were actually aware of all the data coming in, it would overwhelm our brain function. So instead, our brain has a bunch of shortcuts that make approximations about a lot of things. And that's why things like illusions, especially these types of visual illusions, work for us. It's because we're not seeing reality as it is. So, for example, we have a lot of shortcuts that our brain uses for like distance and three-dimensional space. And because of that, if you look at this cube, when you look at this guy, sometimes it looks like the darker lines, like the box is facing to the left. Can you see that? And this is the front of the box, right? And then, of course, now that I've drawn that line, it's going to be harder to see it the other way. So you can also look at it so that the box is facing upwards, and this is the front of the box. You see that? So some people are going to see it one way right away, some people are going to see it the other way, but you should be able to, if you look at the lighter lines, it should flip so that it looks like the box is kind of tilted up. And if you look at the darker lines, it should flip back so that it looks like the box is kind of tilted down and to the left. But it's really just a set of flat lines in two-dimensional space, right? But because of the way our brains perceive stuff, because of how we process the incoming information, we see it both ways. Another classic example. So which square is darker, square A or square B? Anybody want to commit to something?
A.
A. Anybody else? A or B? A, yeah. That's usually what we go with. The truth is that they're the same. Those two squares are the exact same shade. And if you go into the link that I provided, you'll see the full explanation. So if you separate them, like if you isolate it so that all you see is square B and square A, you'll actually be able to see that they're the exact same color, the exact same shade of gray. I can't see it. I think A is darker. Might not work. And that's generally what they show you when you want to break it down, break down the illusion. See, it's a little easier to see now?
Yeah.
Yeah. So our brain knows how shadows work. Like we know how the visual, like how visuals work in reality. And so we can use those cues to trick us in fake situations. So because we know that when something's shadowed, whatever color we see or whatever shade we see is actually lighter, our brain will automatically make it look lighter, even though they're the same shade. But this one was in full light, so obviously that shade is actually darker than this one. So it's a shortcut that our brain takes because in actual reality, that would be useful information. But we can manipulate that and make it look different. That's also where we get color perception differences too. So this is a picture of, it's like a strawberry custard or a strawberry tart or something. I don't know, but they used very large strawberries on top of a tiny little dessert. And as it turns out, if you actually measured the colors used on here, there's no red in this picture. But the strawberries look really red to me. And I'm sure they look really red to most of you, unless red is not a color that you can perceive, which is possible, and that's fine. But we know that strawberries are red. And even though technically these are gray, because they've been placed on whatever color that is, we automatically adjust. And so I can't make myself see that as gray, but if you separated out a little strip of that, you'd be able to only see gray. And I don't feel like scribbling that much, so you guys can do that later. These are all from the same website, which has a ton of illusions, so I totally recommend you check it out if you're not familiar with them, because it's super interesting. And this one explains why a couple years ago, this stupid dress was all over the internet and everybody was arguing over what colors it was. Because of the same things, because the whole situation set it up so that some people perceived the dress as whatever it was, the blue and black, and some people thought it looked gold and white. And you're like, how can they're totally opposite? It doesn't make any sense. But it's that same stuff. We adjust when we think things are in shadow. We adjust based on the whole coloration. And so some people's like brain training, brain shortcuts said, oh, well, based on all the factors, it's this, and based on all the factors, it's that. And so people were having an argument about something that they were all right for their perception. And there was actually an objective answer to it, because you could you know, measure the actual colors being projected up by pixel. But that's not really what made it right, you know? Everybody was right based on their perception. And I didn't actually try to find one. There was an audio version of this a year or so ago where there was some word and some people thought it was one thing and some people thought it was the other. It's the same thing, right? It doesn't matter what the actual sounds were. We were just interpreting it differently because we don't get raw data. We perceive what's been filtered through our cortex, okay? So that's the upper level processing. Okay, anybody have any questions? Okay, so the other half of the somatic system is control over skeletal muscle. And we talked about this a little bit already, so this isn't going to take very long. It's just going to take us into reflex arcs. So the ability to have a response to a stimulus without having cerebral processing. And basically these are the ways in which we involuntarily use our voluntary skeletal muscles, okay? So we talked before when I did the overview of the peripheral nervous system that motor pathways are typically two neurons, right? So there's an upper motor neuron who originates somewhere in the brain, and then there's a lower motor neuron whose cell body is in the ventral horn of the spinal cord and whose other side is the neuromuscular junction of the skeletal muscle, right? So we know that this is how we control muscles, but we also know that we don't always control them on a strictly voluntary basis, right? We are not always telling ourselves to breathe every single breath because we have a nucleus in our brainstem that sets a breathing rhythm and we can override it, but when we don't, it takes over again and we're automatically triggering our diaphragm, remember, via our phrenic nerve, to breathe for us. So reflexive actions can take involuntary control over our skeletal muscles. And a lot of them are at the level of the spinal cord, although this one proves to us that a lot of them are also at the level of the brainstem. So regardless of whether it's voluntary or not, when we, or I guess I take it back. So that's reflexive actions, and we're going to go over it a little bit more later. But first, I want to show you that there are also different processing levels for motor output when it's voluntary. It's a little different because obviously now we're sending out a command, but it's kind of about how all those different brain areas that contribute to motor control actually have their say and like who gets to be in charge. So we have a pre-command level, a projection level, and a segmental level. And it kind of flows like this. So the most important thing to note from here is that even though your motor cortex up in your cerebral cortex, you'd think that that would be the thing in charge, right? I mean, it's definitely the thing that makes decisions to initiate voluntary movements, but it is not actually in charge of carrying out motor movements. And so that's where we get this pre-command level. So the command level is the motor cortex, the cerebral cortex, making the decision to actually do something. I decide that I want to pick up the mug, right, so that I can have another sip of coffee. But above that, as far as who's in charge, the cerebellum and the basal nuclei are actually in charge. So the cerebral cortex makes the decision, but the cerebellum and the basal nuclei are actually the ones that have to carry it out. So, and I am not in the military at all, so I don't, if I say this all wrong, don't get mad at me. But if the cerebral cortex is whoever's the highest level command, right? Like they're the general. The cerebellum and the basal nuclei, though, are the lieutenants that actually do all the work. Okay, so nothing happens without their say-so. So that's why we call it a pre-command level, and it's the highest level of control over motor output for voluntary stuff. All right, so this is kind of showing you how there's a lot of, and you do not need to know these pathways, okay? I'm just trying to show you the best visuals we have. But the point here is that there's a lot of give and take along different levels, because remember that we're constantly fine-tuning this motor output. So after the basal nuclei and the cerebellum are like, okay, this is how we're actually going to do this stuff that the motor cortex wants to do, that's when we get to the segmental level. And the segmental level is able to operate independently, so it can take care of involuntary reflexive movements. And in general, it can also override the pre-command stuff. So like if there's voluntary stuff and you want to do it, you can have a reflex override it. But your pre-command level can also override reflexes if you know they're coming. And so that's why, like, you know, you can, sure you guys are all familiar with, we're going to talk about how it works in a second, but you know, where you hit your knee and your leg jerks, right? Patellar reflex. So the patellar reflex happens at this segmental level, and we'll talk about the pathway in a couple slides. But if you want to override it, you can. If you know it's coming, then you can be like, no, I don't want to do that, right? And you can like tense your muscles so that the reflex doesn't actually occur. So there's a lot of back and forth between these levels of control. But when we look at control of reflexes, they're happening here. So there's processing occurring in the ventral horn. And the reason it's called segmental is because the spinal cord is, of course, arranged in segments, right? That correspond to different spinal nerves. One of the things that we find in here, in addition to reflexes, is something called central pattern generators. So central pattern generators are another way, very similar to the nucleus in your brainstem that controls your breathing rhythm, where things that can be voluntary can then fall down to an involuntary level if you don't need or want to pay attention to them. So the easiest example of this is walking. We have central pattern generators, which are basically just networks of neurons that can set rhythms. So oscillatory neurons are just ones that can set back and forth types of rhythms and patterns of movement. So that when you make a decision to start walking, right? You're walking, and then you like check your phone, or you're looking at the flowers, or, you know, at this point, trying to stay at least 6 feet away from anybody else that's also walking. And so you're not thinking about your actual steps anymore. And so that's when your central pattern generators take over, and they start just doing an automatic walk. And we see this in a lot of animals. And you can actually, if you look at this, there's an article about a dog who's paralyzed, essentially like if he was a person, it would be from the waist down, where he's actually able to walk. He doesn't have control over his back legs, but the pattern generators in his spinal cord are intact. And so if he gets up and you just kind of give him a little push, he does it with his front legs, he kind of gets himself started because he can control his front legs. It might be a she, I don't remember. The pattern generator takes over, and then he's able to walk. And we have those in people too, and it's why we can just keep walking when we're not thinking about walking. And then there's not really good diagrams of that, but we have a couple of the equivalent in other animals. Okay, so segmental level. The projection level is where we actually bring in those motor pathways again. Upper motor neurons, lower motor neurons. So the upper motor neurons are going to have their nuclei in the motor cortex usually, and they are in charge of the pathways that control the voluntary movements. If we have involuntary movements, then we're going to have separate pathways from the brainstem nuclei that do motor stuff. So these guys can modify the segmental control. And so we call this projection level because it's projecting from the brain down to the spinal cord. So you can see it's a little bit different from those processing levels that we talked about. So the projection pathways tell the lower motor neurons what to do. And remember, the lower motor neurons are the only ones that actually synapse with the skeletal muscle. So if you want to control skeletal muscle, you have to be able to influence lower motor neurons. But these pathways also are the ones sending feedback to the higher command levels. So this is where we're also getting information going back up to the cerebellum, up to the basal nuclei, up to the other levels in the brain for that constant feedback, fine-tuning control. Okay, so this is what projection level means. So pre-command is who's actually in charge in the brain. Segmental level is all the stuff that doesn't need the brain. And then projection level is the interaction between them. Which takes us back to this. I don't know how helpful that is, but again, there are not good diagrams on this stuff. So again, sensory input, segmental level is here. This is the kind of the pre-command stuff. I know that doesn't actually say pre-command, but just go with it. And then this guy here and this guy here are our projection level controls. Any questions about that before we get into reflexes? Totally gonna have to do autonomic on tomorrow too. That's great. Okay, so reflexes are any action that is automatic, and very much like action potentials, they tend to be the same thing every single time. Now there's two types of reflexes. There are visceral reflexes, which involve our internal organs and are carried out by the autonomic nervous system that we haven't talked about yet. And then the somatic reflexes are the ones carried out by our somatic nervous system. So basically, if we have a reflex where the effector is skeletal muscle, it's somatic. And if you have a reflex involving anything else, it's visceral. And I put this at the very beginning, even though we haven't actually talked about any of it yet, because you can come back to this later. Okay, so this is kind of a summary of comparing the two types of reflexes that we have. So refer back to it later. Any reflex is something that's going to occur without conscious thought. And not only that, it occurs without any input from the cerebral cortex or the cerebrum at all. So your cerebrum isn't involved, although it often gets notified afterwards, especially with the somatics. So we know that our somatic reflexes take place a lot of the time, right? Like we know that our patellar reflex takes place, but we kind of get told about it afterwards. Now there's different kinds of reflexes, and there's ways we can categorize. So somatic versus visceral is one way that we can categorize. The other way is whether or not we came with it. So there are inborn or innate reflexes. Patellar is one of them. And then there's learned reflexes. And I know it sounds weird that we can learn a reflex, but some of them we do quite young. So for example, when we're born, we have no ability to like blink when something's coming at our eyes. We pick it up later after, as babies, we constantly hit our heads on things and have to protect our eyes because it hurts when things hit your cornea. And so even though everybody has it, with a couple of very rare exceptions, it's still technically learned because we're not born with it. And so there's lots of reflexes that we can learn over time I just don't have any other examples off the top of my head, okay? As opposed to things that were just completely hardwired in, which is what inborn and innate means. Regardless of category, all reflexes have 5 components. And it should kind of look familiar because the components of a reflex arc are the components of a negative feedback loop, okay? Because when we're talking about visceral reflexes, they are feedback loops, okay? Almost all the time. So we're gonna have a receptor that detects a stimulus, which is going to trigger the reflex. We have a sensory neuron. Sometimes that sensory neuron is also the receptor, and sometimes it's not. Either way, the sensory neuron carries the stimulus information to an integration center. The integration center is in charge of processing the information, okay? And sometimes that process can be as simple as a synapse between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron. That is as simple as it gets, but it's still integration. And then we're gonna have a motor neuron carry motor information from the integration center to the effector. The effector then responds to the stimulus, and that completes the reflex arc. So like I said, hopefully this looks familiar because reflex arcs are negative feedback loops. All right, so this is a more specific basic reflex arc. This is showing something that we'll talk about again called the withdrawal reflex, whereby you are stimulated with pain, okay? Don't touch candles, obviously. The pain is carried, detected by, a receptor, sensory receptor for pain, carries it back to the level of the spinal cord. It synapses with an integrating neuron here, which then synapses with a motor neuron here. And then so that's integration right there. And then we have a motor neuron carry information out to move your limb away from the pain. Okay, so then skeletal muscle effector. 5 components every single time, regardless of somatic or visceral, regardless of innate or learned, it's always 5 steps. Stimulus, sensory input, integration, motor output, effector, right? Which is also the 3 things that the nervous system does. All right, so let's look at some examples. We're gonna look mostly at examples of spinal reflexes. So they're occurring at the level of the spinal cord, as in they're not even making it up to the brain at all, as far as the actual reflex. Although, like I said, the brain gets informed about what's happening, but generally speaking, it happens after the fact, because the sensory information is going to take longer to make it up to the brain and get processed than it is to hit the spinal cord, integrate, and have output. But if you know something's coming, you can help the reflex happen better, you can stop the reflex, or you can alter it as you need to. And so we see this for a lot of things like well, like for example, the withdrawal one that I just showed you. I was pulling something out of my toaster oven last night, and I was worried that the lid was hot. So like I touched it and I was like, oh God. And my withdrawal reflex was like super amped. It wasn't actually that hot. It did not burn me. It would not have burned me, but I did it anyways because my experience says this is when you end up using your withdrawal reflex, stop touching hot things, right? So that would be facilitating it. If it looked like something was hot, but you knew it wasn't hot, or for example, things that we do see happen sometimes in real life, like you know it's hot, but you have to touch it, right? You have to touch it. You can override that reflex and just, I know it's gonna hurt, I know I'm gonna wanna let go, but I'm not gonna let go, I'm gonna make the decision not to do it. So that would be inhibiting the reflex. Okay, so we do have that level, but a lot of times when a reflex is happening that we're not expecting, it's usually too fast for us to change it, if that makes sense. That's the whole point of the reflex. The interesting thing too is that connections to the brain are often necessary, so continuous facilitating signals, so a constant input from the brain saying, yes, 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 this is fine, for normal reflex activity. And the consequence of that is that if there's a disruption in the signal between your brain and your spinal cord, you will have abnormal reflexes, even though the circuit for the reflex is intact. So with people with spinal injuries, we will see changes in like the strength of a reflex, even though the circuit for the reflex itself is normal. So like you might see a really excessive patellar reflex in somebody with a spinal cord injury, because now there's no brain input being like, no, this is the appropriate level of that reflex right now. Okay, so one of the reasons why we test these things medically is because it gives us an idea of, neurologic intactness. Now, just like anything else, reflexes can be categorized. So the major thing that we use to categorize reflexes is which side of the body they affect. But the big one that we see get talked about is how many synapses are involved in the integration portion. And basically our option is one or more than one, okay? Monosynaptic versus polysynaptic. And I'll give you examples of both. Which side of the body they affect is compared to the stimulus. So ipsilateral means the same side, as in the stimulus and the response are on the same side of the body. So the withdrawal reflex is a perfect example of this. You feel something hot, and that same part of your body is going to come away from that. Contralateral is opposite. So a contralateral reflex affects the opposite side of your body from the stimulus. And I will show you an example of that later. Bilateral means both sides, as in regardless of which side the stimulus is on, both sides of your body respond to it. And we don't have great somatic examples of that, but when we get to autonomic, we'll see that that's more common. Technically, we also divide it up by how many levels of spinal cord are involved in the processing. So if it all occurs at a single spinal cord level, we call it a segmental reflex. And if it occurs like at multiple levels, like if it actually goes up or down the spinal cord during the integration portion, it would be intersegmental. But I don't have a great example of that for you right now, so we're not going to worry about it too much. So ipsilateral means it's on the same side of the body. And the first example I'm going to give you will be ipsilateral. So I'll give you an ipsilateral and a contralateral example, and they'll be listed on there too, and that'll make it more clear. Okay, so the first one we're going to do is stretch reflex, and it's literally the patellar. And so then we'll go through one that's kind of the opposite of that, and then another one that goes along with it. In order to understand this, we have to touch just a little bit on the sensory receptors for this. So we have specialized receptors in the skeletal system or the musculoskeletal system to detect changes in tendons and muscles to keep them safe. So muscle spindles are specialized receptors within muscles that are in charge of monitoring muscle length. And so there's a bunch of stuff in there. We've got these modified muscle fibers that are enclosed in a little sheath. And of course, there are sensory receptors. And then there's special muscle fibers in there too. So there's two different types of specialized muscle fibers. So it looks like this. They're teeny tiny. And basically, we've got these muscle fibers who don't contract. They just monitor length. And then they're, of course, connected to the sensory nerves. And then we've got other muscle fibers that make sure that they're always able to monitor length no matter how stretched or not the muscle is. And so they get controlled by stuff too. So the point of a stretch reflex is to make sure that the muscle actually stays at whatever length the brain has told it to. So for example, they're involved in maintaining muscle tone, and if you unexpectedly stretched a muscle, it would reflexively adjust it. So we see this especially in postural muscles, and this is a great example of as simple as it gets. This is an ipsilateral, as in it happens on the same side as the stimulus, monosynaptic reflex. And when you have a monosynaptic reflex, it's the sensory neuron coming in and integrating directly with the motor neuron. So you literally have a single synapse as your integration center. It's the synapse between the sensory input and the motor output. Does not get simpler than that. And then this is just showing you that basically the brain, or not the brain, the spinal cord knows how stretched the muscle is, because the more stretched it is, the more, the higher frequency of signals it sends. But we don't need to worry about that too much. I just like visuals. So how this works is if the muscle is rapidly stretched, it sends an increased signal back to the spinal cord. And if it's sufficiently high, then it will activate the motor neuron, because this is the integration center right here, right? It'll activate the motor neuron, and then we'll send a signal to the normal skeletal muscle to contract. And so the easiest way to test that is actually to, actually tap on a tendon. You tap on the tendon, it stretches the muscle very unexpectedly, and then you get this reflexive contraction that causes a little twitch. And it's not just your leg that can do that, it's other parts of your body as well. But the leg one's the easiest. Now, if you don't relax the antagonist muscle, then this reflex is kind of useless. And so the interesting thing is that even though this is a very, very simple reflex, it does not occur alone. So reciprocal inhibition is when we have to make sure that the opposing muscles cooperate during a reflexive contraction, so that they're not contracted too and they don't accidentally stop the reflex from happening. So reciprocal inhibition is relaxing the muscles that act as antagonists when this particular muscle is contracted. So it's actually a secondary reflex that occurs at the same time, triggered by the same stimulus. So for example, the patellar reflex. You tap on the patellar ligament. This stretches the muscles of the quadriceps, and it triggers, so that's the stimulation, is the stretch. So then we have a sensory neuron coming in and synapsing with the motor neuron. So that's our sensory input, integration, motor output goes back to the same muscle and causes contraction, right? So then we get that little leg twitch. If we do not relax these hamstring muscles at the same time, it's not going to happen nearly as well, right? Because if we want to be able to extend the leg, we cannot block it with muscles that flex the leg. I do not have that. Okay. All right. So the reciprocal inhibition is the sensory input also comes in and synapses with a separate motor neuron that causes relaxation. Separate reflex happening at the same time, which I should have had picture there. Maybe it's coming out later. I don't know. Anyway, so in order to make sure that it's appropriately monitoring the situation, the muscle spindle is able to change its sensitivity. And it can do that with input from the brain. So this is where we get that whole idea of, even though the brain isn't directly involved in the reflex, the brain connection constantly facilitating the reflex is necessary for an appropriate response. So because the brain is getting all the proprioceptive inputs, it knows what the whole leg is doing, and it can be like, okay, now's a good time to be super sensitive about this situation because we don't want to overstretch the muscle and tear it, so let's make sure we're paying attention. So we better increase the sensitivity. So really crank those special muscle fibers so that any extra stretch is going to cause this response. And it can also say, okay, it's fine now. Nothing bad's going to happen. So don't worry about it. Loosen up, and it's going to have to take a crazy amount of stretching to trigger the reflex. Okay, that's what the brain's doing. It's fine-tuning it depending on circumstance. Anybody have any questions about that? Because going forward doesn't help unless we understand that one. All right, I'm gonna try to just get through these somatic ones, and I'll just do autonomic tomorrow, I guess. And I don't know, maybe I'm doing special senses on Friday. I don't know what's happening. I'll send announcements. Okay, so tendon reflex. I swear I tried to cut this stuff. It all feels important. Okay, so tendon reflexes are the opposite of stretch reflexes. So where the idea of stretch reflexes is to like prevent overstretching of the muscle, which is why it automatically contracts. Tendon reflexes want the muscle to be able to stretch or relax if it's stretched too much. So the first one's all about like appropriate posture. This one is all about preventing damage. So now we have receptors in the tendon. So there's a tendon organ. It works very, very similarly to the muscle spindle, where it responds to stretch, but it's in the tendon now. And sometimes you'll see it called that. Don't worry about that. Nobody cares. And so basically, if this area is stretched, it's going to send stimulation up to the spinal cord. Okay. Now, the tendon reflex is also ipsilateral. I don't know why that wasn't on the previous slide, but now it's polysynaptic. And it's polysynaptic because there is a single interneuron connecting our sensory receptor and our sensory neuron and motor neuron. Okay, you see that? So now there's two synapses for the integration step of the reflex. So now, if we get stretch, so let's say we're really flexing hard, so then we're stretching the tendon, we're kind of straining it, right? That triggers the tendon organ, sensory receptor in, synapses with the interneuron, which then, if it's sufficiently stimulated, synapses with the motor neuron, go back and we relax the muscle. You're working too hard, you're gonna damage yourself, relax. This kind of puts upper limits on how much we can lift a lot of the time, or strain, like how much weight we can work against, because it's trying to keep us from hurting ourselves. Now, this also has reciprocal inhibition. Okay, so we're so we're relaxing this guy, and we want to make sure we don't, I don't know, like fall over or something. I don't remember why it happens, but we also have a separate reflex that gets triggered by the same stimulus. So same sensory neuron branches synapses with a different interneuron, which synapses with a motor neuron to the antagonist muscles and causes them to contract. Because whatever we're doing in the initial reflex, we're going to do the opposite with the antagonistic muscles. So whereas before, with the patellar reflex, with the stretch reflex, where we're contracting the muscle reflexively, we want to relax the antagonists. but now we're relaxing the effectors, so we need to contract the antagonists. All right, so it's all about making sure that we're still coordinating our muscle movements in groups, even as we have these reflexive actions. So reciprocal inhibition is really common. And so even though we learn these reflexes a lot of time as if they're isolated, it all works together. Now, we see that even more when we look at this with a withdrawal reflex. So the withdrawal reflex is the example I gave you at the beginning, where you are flexing part of your body in response to a painful stimulus, right? Protecting yourself from damage. So just like the previous one, this is ipsilateral, same side of the body, and polysynaptic. So just like the last one, there's going to be at least one neuron synapsing between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron. Now, the other thing that we see is an additional reflex that often accompanies withdrawal. But this time, instead of being just a reciprocal inhibition, it's a contralateral reflex that keeps us from falling on our faces. So if we're withdrawing, let's say we step on something very painful and we automatically contract our leg away from that, right? Ow, pick your leg up. How do you not fall over? Well, you got to put the other leg down, right? So that reflex is called the crossed extensor reflex. So because you're reflexively, it's a freaking tongue twister, reflexively flexing due to pain, right? Hurts, get away from the damage. You also have to reflexively extend the opposite limb. And you do this not only with your legs, you can do this with your arms too. So if you were leaning on something and one arm, you had pain with one hand, you would reflexively extend with the other to keep yourself, again, from falling on your face. So this one is contralateral, and again, it's polysynaptic. So when we look at them, we like to look at them at the same time. So this is both of them going on at the same time. I don't know why they thought that somebody grabbing your arm was the appropriate stimulus for this, but whatever. We'll just make it some fire. Okay, fire makes way more sense. Okay, so painful or noxious stimulus. Sensory receptor up to the spinal cord, synapses with, look at this, 2 interneurons. Haha. Okay, so polysynaptic. We're going to reflexively contract the flexors so that we're withdrawing, okay? And we're going to reciprocally inhibit the extensors so that it doesn't block the motion. And we're going to cross over to the other side and do the opposite on the other side. So a single reflex triggers 4 different reflexive actions here. So now we're also contracting the extensors with another 2-neuron polysynaptic situation and relaxing our flexors, right? Makes sense. We always have to reciprocally inhibit so that we're not blocking the response. So it looks like a mess, but it's really just pulling away from a painful stimulus automatically, and the consequences of that to make sure it works. Now, there are other reflexes, and they don't all involve all sorts of crazy things. So some of them we get categorized as superficial. Superficial reflexes are reactions to gentle skin stimulation, but they're still somatic in that they still trigger skeletal muscle responses. So for example, I've never looked for video on this. Abdominal reflexes, you should be able to get contraction of the abdominal muscles with gentle skin stimulation of the abdominal skin. I don't know, it's weird. The other one that you may or may not have experienced before is the plantar response. So, and we're gonna, I totally forgot to make this go live, but I'll make it go live later. There is a little simulation on McGraw-Hill that goes through some of these reflexes so you guys can see them. So with the plantar, if you stimulate the lateral, the outside of the bottom of your foot, okay, the lateral aspect of the plantar aspect of your foot, it'll cause a reflexive curling of the toes, okay? I don't know why. It's just what happens. I think it's meant to I think it's kind of like a withdrawal. Anyway, but that's the plantar response. Now, there's also an abnormal response, and this is why we test it, because if something is going on up there, you'll actually get something called the Babinski sign. And so instead of curling the toes, you fan the toes. And this is actually normal in infants before they fully myelinated their nerves. And then it becomes this once they've myelinated all their nerves. So we can test this in a couple different ways. You want to make sure that an infant is doing this, and then you want to make sure in an adult that they've transferred to this because something's wrong with their nervous system now if they're still doing that or they're doing that again. So lots of reflexes, and testing them gives us a lot of information if we're worried that something is going wrong with the nervous system. So infant reflexes like that Babinski sign are ones that exist when we're born, and then they go away as we get older, or they transition to something else. And then there are other reflexes that develop as we get older. So like I said, they're not, we don't typically get born with the ability to reflexively blink when something comes at our eye, and then we develop that later as experience takes us through that situation of hitting your face on things. So like infants, for example, you'll stroke their cheek and they turn towards it. That's their reflex to getting milk. And luckily that goes away when we get older because we don't need that later on, right? It's only necessary when you're nursing and you're so young that you don't have enough other responses to know how to, get yourself food. So reflexes necessary for infant survival are a lot of the times going to fade away because they're no longer useful once we get older. So these are a couple of links about neurological exams that kind of go through reflexes and other things. You don't have to look at them, but they are useful in that if some of these motor responses are confusing, this might help. This one's actually another free textbook. And I just felt like it explained a couple things better than ours did. So something to look at if you feel like you need more information, okay? So we will hit autonomic nervous system. I will do it tomorrow at like 9:30 or 10, and I'll send out an announcement tonight, and then I'll send an invite, but it's okay if nobody can come because it's an off time, and then do the special senses at the same time. For now, let's just take a minute, and then I'll show you guys the rest of the nervous system lab stuff, okay?